briefly now in a bit more detail about what those are and what should be provided in them. But first, I just wanted to point out where you can find the existing guidance on publication policies. So this is in the implementation guidance section of the OCDS documentation. So if you go to standard.opencontracting.org, on the left-hand side there, you've got implementation guidance, and then publication policies as subheadings. So there's a little bit of content there, which we'll kind of talk through over the next couple of slides. So what is a publication policy and what should it cover? So first of all, using a data standard means that users have access to definitions for the fields that are in the data and additional guidance on how those fields are used. So by publishing OCDS data, we're already making it easier for users to understand what the data set contains. But publication policy goes beyond just the publication of data to help users understand how the data got there and how it should be interpreted. So what's important to know about that OCDS data set in that particular context, so how it was produced and any other contextual information users need to be aware of. There's a lot of decisions involved in producing OCDS data, as the many publishers we've got on the call today will know. And the publication policy provides an opportunity really to document those decisions and explain what is and isn't included in the data and help users to understand what to expect from the data. We just got a screenshot on the right-hand side there, the slide of the UK's publication policy, which we'll be looking at in a little bit more detail in Andrew's presentation. So within OCDS data itself, there is a field you can use to link to your publication policy, so that puts that data in that context. And what that means is that even if someone picks up that data secondhand, so they didn't download it from your website or from your API, they still have a reference back to how that information was originally created and that contextual information that's provided alongside it. So the bottom half of the slide there, we've just got a screenshot of some data from the UK. You can see there's a publication policy field, and that links to that page that we saw on the previous slide. So in terms of what to include, I'll just talk through these very briefly and then we'll go into them in more detail on the next slide. But we recommend you include an introduction and some context and some information about the scope of the data. A point of contact that's responsible for the data, so somewhere to ask questions and give feedback. Some information about how frequently and the process that's used to produce the data. Information about what's excluded from the data. Any details of any custom code lists or extensions, so anything that's different to the core OCDS schema. And then also information on your plans for publication and future plans, so how the data might change in the future. So to tackle the first point there, in terms of providing an introduction and context, that's really important to help users understand why the data is being published and how it fits in the context of wider reforms to public contracting. The other thing we recommend you provide is a summary of the scope of the data, to help users understand the limits of the data without having to analyze the whole data set. So that might be, for example, information about what stages of the contracting process are covered, what date range the data covers, whether only procurements over a certain value threshold are included. So whatever you can provide here to give users of the data a heads up about that, rather than them, for example, having to download the whole data set to understand what date range it covers. The next point we recommend you include is information on who's responsible for the data. So that's really a way of putting in place a feedback loop, so a way for you to understand if people are having difficulty using the data, and how you can get input on ways in which the data can be improved. The other important thing to provide is a summary of how often the data is published, and what the process of publishing the data is, because that can help users understand how it relates to the data that's held, for example, in an e-procurement system from which the OCDS data might be exported. So we've just got a couple of good examples we saw here. I think the first one was from Paraguay, and that explains for each data set in their open data portal when it was published and just how frequently it's updated, whether it's monthly, weekly or daily. And then the second example here is just a brief textual description of the process used to produce data. So there's potential to kind of expand on that with diagrams, etc., to make it even more understandable for users. But just that level of information there can be really helpful to people working with the data. Another key thing to include is exclusions from the data. So in an ideal world, an OCDS publication would include all possible contracting processes that happen in a given country or jurisdiction, but we know that there's cases where particular contracting processes or particular fields of data can't be disclosed, and there can be different reasons for that. But it's really important to be clear with users for them to know when they pick up the data what is and isn't included. So by setting out those reasons in a publication policy, it means the users know what to expect, but also it means that they can check whether that reasoning is being applied consistently. So a couple of reasons for non-disclosure can be timing, so that can be where information can't be disclosed until a particular process, say approvals or appeals, is completed, or just practicality of where data can't be generated from a particular system, perhaps because access to the database isn't available, or there's no longer a relationship with the provider of that system where they can make any changes to it. But again, it's just important to kind of put that information up front rather than leaving it to users to kind of figure out for themselves. And we've got some examples on the left there, I think, from the UK, from one of our Latin American partners, and from Uruguay. On examples of just being really clear and upfront about what is and isn't included. Both of the policy examples on the left here mention commercially sensitive information as an exclusion from the open contracting data, but it should be noted that should really only be limited to genuinely commercially sensitive information. So it's not a catch-all exception, but rather it's a narrow exception about specific pieces of information in specific documents which are considered commercially sensitive, rather than a blanket kind of catch-all of we won't publish any contracts because they are commercially sensitive. OCP have recently published a myth-busting report on confidentiality in public contracting, which goes into much more detail in this area and really breaks down very specific types of information and when they would or wouldn't be considered commercially sensitive. So I'd really recommend everybody takes a look at that. The URL for the report is there. You can find it on the Open Contracting website, and that can be a really useful resource to support those conversations about what should and shouldn't be disclosed. The other point mentioned in the publication policy is providing your publication plan or implementation plan. So on the OCP website, we have a template for the publication plan here, which provides you with a way to write up all the major decisions from your OCDS implementation and the mapping between OCDS and your systems. And that really focuses on aligning the publication of data with user needs, so making it really clear why the information has been provided and which parts of the information are useful for different types of user. We haven't seen many examples yet of these being published, although in the UK there is these two documents on the right which are published. So one is a kind of high-level mapping of notice types, and one's a more detailed mapping of individual fields. But again, this just helps users to understand the scope of the data they're dealing with and any future plans as well for how that data might change, for example, when new systems are added and extra stages of the contracting process might be included in the data set. So just to talk briefly on licenses as well, so a slightly separate thing from the publication policy. There's a separate place in your OCDS data to declare your license, but we tend to recommend it's also included in the publication policy because it's so important. So it's really important because they make it clear there's no restriction on reuse of the data. So without providing that license, users might not know what they are and aren't able to do with the data, which can obviously limit the benefits of getting contracting data out there in the open. So we recommend using either a public domain dedication type license or a attribution only license. So the difference between those is in a public domain dedication, you're saying there's no copyright, database rights or any other type of rights over the data that you're releasing. You're putting it in the public domain and saying people can use that in whichever way they see fit. The difference in an attribution only license is you're still saying the license allows for people to use and reuse that data, but the only restriction is that they must give attribution or credit to where the data originally came from. Some publishers do use custom licenses, so the logos on the right hand side there are from the Creative Commons licenses. But if you do use it, we don't recommend using custom license because it kind of puts the onus on the users of the data to read that license in detail and understand what can and can't be done, whereas using one of these standard licenses, these are licenses that people should be familiar with, so if they see that, they know straight away that they can use and reuse that data freely. But if you do use a custom license, then you should check that it's compliant with the open definition of a license to make sure you've not unintentionally kind of restricted use in the way the license is written. Final point here, and this isn't mentioned, I don't think, in our publication policy guidance, but as we saw from the UK, it is something that some publishers are starting to publish, and that's providing a mapping or a data dictionary alongside your OCDS data that shows how the fields in OCDS map to the local terms in your procurement legislation or your procurement systems. So that's really important if users are already familiar with the kind of specific country context and naming conventions, etc. But they want to work with the OCDS data. By providing that mapping, it gives them a big leg up to do that. We do provide a template for the mapping in the resources section of the OCP website. But that's really a tool to help publishers work through the mapping process. But it could be used as a basis, or perhaps a cut down version of that could be published in the publication policy. So a couple of final points before we hear from Agnes to get the user perspective. But often we see in open contracting initiatives, it's not just the data that's published, there's also tools to go with that to help users explore the data. So again, providing links to those in your publication policy can help users discover them. So if they're working with a piece of data, they follow the link to the publication policy, and then they find in there that actually there's already another type of tool that can help them explore that data. So that's really important to include. And the other thing to include is links to the different mechanisms or formats in which the data is available. So again, if somebody's working with a JSON data file, they might follow the link to the publication policy and find out there that in fact there's also flattened data or an interactive API which they can query to get more data. So really just trying to join up all the different ways that users can interact with the data and make sure that they're able to discover those in the publication policy. So I think that's enough from me on the kind of overall guidance of what we've learned should be included in the publication policy. So I'm going to hand over now to Agnes from the Government Transparency Institute, who's been working on some analysis of OCDS data. We're going to learn a bit more about the lessons learned and the challenges that they've faced in understanding that data. Agnes, do you have your slides ready to present?
I can view the slides. Oh,
okay, great. I'll get them up on my screen then. Cool.
Okay. Shall I tell you when to move to the next slide, or
yes.
Procedure? Okay.
Perfect. That sounds good.
Okay, then. In the meantime, I'm going to introduce myself. So I'm working for Government Transparency Institute, and we are specialized in analyzing public procurement data. And currently we have joint project with the Open Contracting Partnership. So we are providing consultancy services in this monitoring, evaluation, and learning activity of OECD, which is part of their Latin America strategy. And this is really a twofold project because on the one hand, we are collecting and downloading public procurement data in Mexico, Colombia, and Chile. And we are calculating indicators based on this data, which aim to measure performance of from several aspects, such as level of competition, companies' chances to get involved in public procurement, or the level of transparency and accessibility of data. But on the other hand, there is another aspect of this work which is equally important. We are examining the usability of this data by recording data gaps, technical issues, if we face any of them. So this is really a learning process in which we try out in real life how easy is using the procurement data published in these countries. Next slide, please. Thank you. What we are doing exactly is the following. We identify data sources, both the official national public procurement data publications and the data published in OCDS format. We review these sources, so what time period they cover, what kind of notices and contracts are there, what kind of information, what kind of variables are published, so how rich is this database. And then we'll download the data we need. We linked data sets together if we needed to use more than one data sources parallelly. Then we also ran some basic data quality checks and screening procedures. We analyzed the rate of missing values, potential errors, or suspiciously high or low values. So basically, this is the preparation of the data set. And next slide, please. Thank you. In the next step, we are developing indicators, but this task is not really the focus of this course, so I won't speak much of this, but in a nutshell, we try to capture aspects such as efficiency of the procurement process, level of competition on certain markets, or the value for money of the purchased goods and services. But it's way more important that we have this extra task. So we document every technical issue, data gaps, data quality issues, which prevent us from calculating the indicators we think would be necessary for a really robust analysis with comparable results. So we also take notes if accessing and using the data seem to be unnecessarily complicated and such issues. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to share our experiences about working with this data. But I think it's very important to emphasize that it's really great that these data sets exist at all in their current format, even if there is always room for improvement. And this goes for the OCDS publication and the official publications as well, because in the past few years, I've worked on 15 countries' procurement data approximately, mostly European countries. And I have to tell that it's very common that bulk download in CSV or JSON is not available in most countries. We really have to scrape data from HTML pages. So compared to this, the downloadable Excel CSVs and the OCDS publication in these countries we analyzed are incomparably easier to use. But still, we faced a few challenges, and most of them were related to the fact that parallel publications exist in these countries. So OCDS publication and the official national publication lead side by side, but their content is not exactly the same. So at first, we considered in this project using only OCDS publication because it is a standard structure which we have already been familiar with. We know the language, know the content of the variables, and we don't have to start to understand country-specific procurement language from zero because it is already translated to OCDS language. But the problem was that the official public procurement sources contain more data than the OCDS publication, either in the sense that longer time period was covered, such as in Mexico, where OCDS publication started in 2017, or in the sense that it contained additional pieces of information which were crucial for our analysis, such as procurement type or information about budget overrun. So that's why in the end we decided to use both datasets, OCDS and the official national as well. But this became quite challenging due to the different structure of the dataset, the language differences, and really the overlap between the datasets was unclear. And other technical issues also emerged, like linking these datasets together. So at the end, we overcome these challenges more or less, mostly by asking a lot from national experts and by working together with a very experienced software development company, which helped us mainly in this merging dataset task. But we still have concerns if all these data manipulations were done correctly or not. And we are still running checks on these datasets. And surely this was challenging, but in a sense for us, this is not a problem. I mean, this is our work, we are paid for this, but these data issues would certainly limit the usability of data for those who don't have these resources at hand, such as citizens interested in this data or students who are doing research using these databases. So in the end, we asked the question from ourselves, what would have made the data collection easier? And there is the next slide, thank you. And to answer this question, we drew up two answers. And this is the point where publication policies enter the picture. So in an ideal case, it would be really great if OCDS could serve as an integrator of all relevant national sources in terms of time period, coverage of contracts, and information content. And the data is already collected in official publications, so at least time period coverage increase could be done relatively easily, I think. But adding additional information to OCDS from official publications could be more challenging because the OCDS structure doesn't offer a place for all country-specific information, which is published in official publications. But perhaps this problem could be overcome by working on OCDS extensions, which allow for adding country-specific information to the core OCDS structure. This could be a solution. And our second answer or solution to the question, what would have made the data collection easier, is that if covering everything with OCDS is not an option due to lack of resources or other reasons, publishing more detailed OCDS-focused documentation could still help a lot. And this documentation package should include the description of data coverage of the OCDS and the official publication, and the reasons behind the different case numbers in these two data sets. And it would be also great to have a dictionary between OCDS variables and the official dataset variables, because being a non-expert, it's often hard to decide how a variable of the official dataset could be fitted into OCDS structure. But actually in the first presentation this was already mentioned, and I think this question of mapping templates is really important when we try to make use of open data in public procurement. And last but not least, technical information and the correct way of linking existing procurement data sets together would be really useful to. This means that if I can be sure that a clear unique ID can be found both in the OCDS publication and the official data set, it would allow for adding extra information from one data set to the other. Yeah, so in a nutshell, I wanted to share these experiences with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnes. That was great. Really insightful to see, you know, the balance there of OCDS making it easier, but then the challenges that you're facing as experts in this area of analysing the data. So that's a great kind of challenge for us. If it can still be difficult for you guys, what extra information do we need to provide to make this as easy as possible for users who perhaps aren't as expert in analysing procurement data? And right now we see that, you know, a lot of publishers don't include a publication policy, and I think that presentation really highlights some of the challenges that can cause, and ultimately we're all interested in improving public contracting through the use of data, so we should really focus in on not just getting the data out there, but focusing on how to make using it as easy as possible. I think we just had one quick question from Marcella for Agnes, which I think we've got time to take now. And Marcella wanted to know whether the official national publications you were mentioned were available as open data, or whether you were scraping those.
In Mexico and in Colombia,
Sorry,
can you hear me now? Or okay, there was some strange noise, but now I try to answer the question. So in Mexico and in Colombia, the official data sets are also open, so you can download them as a bulk download in Excel or in CSV, which is very great. But in Chile, I think until last week there were only HTML pages, and we tried to scrape them. But if I'm correct, just last week, OCDS was published, so all the public procurement data was published in OCDS, but it's a very new story.
Great, thanks, Agnes. Okay, great. So we'll move on to the next presentation now, and we've got some time at the end if people have any more questions on Agnes's presentation. So thank you again for that. I'll just juggle my screens quickly. So we're going to look now at a couple of real-world examples of publication policies, and have our partners from Zambia and the UK talk through what they provide alongside the data and what the considerations behind that were. So first up, we've got Ethel from the Zambia Public Procurement Agency. So Ethel, if you're just able to unmute, that would be great. Zambia recently implemented an e-government procurement system and started publishing OCDS data, and they've got a really good publication policy alongside that. So it'd be great, Ethel, if you could just talk us through what information you provide. So Ethel, we can't hear you right now. It does look like you're muted. So if you could just check your audio settings and make sure you're unmuted. Hello, Ethel. Can you? Hello. I think we can hear you now. Actually, no. It seems like we're having some connection problems there. I suggest perhaps we move on to Andrew's presentation, and if we can get Ethel's audio problems resolved, we'll come back to that next. Okay, great. So Andrew, hopefully your audio is working all right. So Andrew's, as you mentioned before, Head of Transparency and Procurement at the Cabinet Office in the UK, who are responsible for Crown Commercial Services, which is the central procurement authority in the UK, and they provide a really comprehensive set of information to go alongside their OCDS data. So Andrew's going to talk us through that now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I thought I'd just give a bit of the background first, and because that's really what informs the sort of information that we're publishing. Is that all right, as per the bullets?
Of course. Yeah, of course.
So things go back a little while. We first started to get into this game when we had a report done by an entrepreneur called the Glover report, which recommended a single free-to-access portal for low-value opportunities. So obviously, while the UK is in the EU, we're subject to the European procurement regulations, but that has a relatively high threshold if you're a small business. So the recommendation was that we pulled all that a lot together in one place. We then had an election, as we do, and the new coalition government made a commitment to publish central government contracts, and hence we got into transparency and procurement, not just about opportunities. I was the senior responsible owner putting in place a system we now call Contracts Finder. So that was launched in 2011 as one portal for covering both requirements, so both low-value opportunities and government contracts. We then had to refresh the public contract regulations to align them with the latest European directives, and in doing that, we had a set of commitments around the SME agenda, and that put Contracts Finder on a regulatory basis. So our UK public contract regulations require all non-devolved contracting authorities to publish, and we've got two thresholds. Central government is a £10,000 threshold. Outside of central government, it's 25,000. So one of the things that we end up with these regulatory requirements and policy initiatives is a need to explain them to folk. So that drives us having information available on our gov.uk system, and that is one of the reasons why, when we got involved in open contracting, we needed to have a page on there that focuses our attention, as you can see. One of the things that also drive us, we've been very active in the Open Government Programme and committing to our 2-year action plans. So we committed to open contracting in the 2013-15 action plan, and then we committed to publishing under the Open Contracting Data Standard for Crown Commercial Service in the 2016-18 action plan. And clearly, we wanted to explain to folk what we were doing, and so we've put up references to that in our background, because we took that commitment quite seriously. What do we publish? It covers all non-devolved UK buyers, so they're all required to put things on Contracts Finder. It's a noticing system, it's not an e-procurement system, and that, I think, is one of the things that we try and explain. It's made available in OCDS format via an API, which we provide details of, and we also provide daily files to data.gov. We've engaged with users during this process. It's quite an important part of our process. So we set up a steering group to get civil society engagement. So Open Contracting Partnerships sits on that steering group. We have excellent support from the OCDS Help Desk, but also we've got organisations like the National Audit Office, the Institute for Government, National Council of Voluntary Organisations. So that helps us inform what we need, and clearly some of those users are actually going to use our data. So that's where the mapping document that was shown earlier came from. You know, actually not just publish the data, but show us in some detail what we've got. We've got a number of data users who we know consume that data, and they probably fall into two groups. One is commercial organisations who take our data and other data sets, blend them together and provide information for those working around public procurement who want to either do business with government or to support people who are doing business with government. So we know people have an interest in that. We have data users who are so much closer to civil society, who need to understand what they can and can't find on our system. We've also started to use the data ourselves within government. So we have we blend together information from the contracts finder public domain information with internal spend data. So again, all of those folk need to know what we're doing. In 2016, we signed up with the Open Contracting Partnership to have a showcase and learning project, set ourselves some very, sorry, someone send me some chat. So we've set up a system to pull that together into a dashboard to improve commercial decision making. So basically, we've had a set of evolution going on here all the way through, and in fact today is another day. I don't know if anyone's picked up on this yet, but we've just published a new draft commitment for our National Action Plan going forward, which will see us looking effectively at continuous improvement. So that isn't available on our website yet, but is available via the via the Open Government Network. So people can see what we're proposing to do in the future. Is that what you were hoping for, folks?
That's great. Thanks, Andrew. And I guess there was just a couple of other bits I wanted to draw out. I know somewhere on here you have the document that shows the mapping of the notice types and statuses. I'm just struggling to see it just now, but that's a really useful document. Where is it? Okay, maybe I don't need to show that on screen, but yeah, the other thing to highlight here is as we recommended, we've got the information about all the different ways in which the data is published, so the daily snapshot, the API interface, documentation for the API. So it's kind of a central point for all the information users need to interact with the data, so that's really, really useful. And then there's a kind of 7-page publication guide here, which gives more of that kind of introduction and scope information. And I think I've just remembered, this is where the notice mapping is. Yes, it's at the end of this document. So this is for people who are familiar with the terminology in Contracts Finder, and they can see how that maps onto the OCDS data. So hopefully bridging that gap of anybody who's already kind of using existing APIs or scraping data from existing publications. So thanks, Andrew. That was really good. And we'll try and switch back to Ethel now.
Can I just add one?
Of course, yeah.
Just a brief bit. So we're founder members of the Contracting 5, and one of the things we did with them is work to pull together common information on what each of the members was doing, and that's now been pulled together thanks to our colleagues in Ukraine into the Contracting 5 website. So it would be good if you could circulate the C5 website link with the in the notes following the call, because that's a resource showing what all of the Contracting 5 folk are doing.
Great, thanks, Andrew. We'll make sure to include that in the slides that we share afterwards.
I think
Great.
we're still having some audio difficulties from Ethel, but Muno might be able to speak on Ethel's behalf.
Great. Over to you, Muno, if you're able to speak.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you now.
You're coming through loud and clear, and just let me know if there's particular links you'd like me to click whilst you're talking.
Okay, that's fine. The same one that's up is okay. All right. So thank you once again. I just wanted to. By the way, Ethel and I are in a different geographic location, so that's why we're having sort of different experiences with the technology. Just wanted to highlight on a few things. In terms of our publication policy, we pretty much followed the guidance on the OCDS website. In addition to that, we do have different other sort of legal frameworks. One thing we have is the Public Procurement Act of Zambia. In addition to that, we have the Electronic Communications Publication Transaction Act as well. So we pretty much followed the guidance from the OCDS publication guidance in terms of the policy, as well as the two legal frameworks we have locally in Zambia. In addition to that, I just wanted to share maybe a few of our experiences in terms of the actual data on the OCDS. In terms of the actual publication policy, I don't know, perhaps the community can chip in on this as well. We don't really see where aspects of maybe user trust in the data. I don't know who can highlight a bit more on that. What I mean is, I think Agnes also highlighted on this point. In terms of the data we publish on the OCDS, you see, we are running two parallel systems. So in addition to the OCDS platform, we also run an e-procurement system. It's a Java-based system. So what we find is that system, if we go along the lines of what Agnes was talking about in terms of the national system for open contracting, our OCDS platform basically scrapes data from that system. And what we find is the sort of national system tends to have a bit more information than the OCDS itself. So in terms of the data accuracy, I don't know if I can use either accuracy or perhaps reliability. What we find is the data on the OCDS doesn't always come up as reliable as the data on the official e-procurement system. The result of that, I don't know if I can share maybe some of the reports. Maybe I can just share one report. Tim, I don't know if you can just go to the OCDS, the Zambian OCDS. So just from the website, you can go to Open Contracting.
Yeah.
So if you could pull up maybe that spend category, that spend awards by spend category. It's one of the reports somewhere down below there. Yes, that one. Okay, so what we find is we have a beautiful pie chart there which shows basically where money is being spent. So the issue is, if you go to the official e-procurement system, you find that the data on the OCDS is so dependent on processes being completed in the official, say, national e-procurement system. So what you find is, you might interpret this chart, for example, in a certain way. It doesn't really show the actual picture, the full picture, because what we have is, if you visit the official procurement system, what you find there is a lot of those processes, procurement processes in that system, those are not being completed. They might not be completed on time, which means that this pie chart will probably give a wrong interpretation of what's really going on. So I don't know, maybe a question for the community. I don't know how this gap, this issue can be addressed. I think from our experience also, what we found is when we developed the e-procurement system, we sort of developed that system sort of at the same time as the OCDS system. So maybe a gap in terms of capacity nationwide, I'm not sure. But what we learned there is that in terms of user engagement, in regards to OCDS as well as the other publication policy, it hasn't really worked hand in hand smoothly, because there are still maybe capacity issues which need to be dealt with in the official e-procurement system, which obviously affect the data on the CCDS. So I don't know. Maybe the community can comment on that. I don't know how my point is clear on that one.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Thanks, Mino. So I guess it kind of highlights that implementing OCDS is really only part of the picture in terms of making sure that the engagement and capacity building, if you like, with users and potential users of the data is there to make sure that the intended benefits can be reached. But I think you raise another interesting point here about what would be the important information to provide alongside these charts and reports that are based on the OCDS data to make it clear to users if they only include completed processes, or if they're only updated on a certain frequency. Does anybody else have any thoughts to share on that?
I can come in just. Sorry, I've just put in chat some notes from Ethel around how disclosure prior to the OCDS platform was only available to participating bidders. But now people have got the information, but I think it was really interesting to hear your reflections on the challenges of getting it up to the quality you want. And it sparked for me a kind of reflection on publication policies, and policies being something that are fairly set in stone, but maybe it's also needing to encourage people to have like a status page that has a more kind of dynamic report on the current quality of data, known issues, and that helps us communicate that doing this well is an honest. It's not something that's forgotten, but it's something that we do and we improve over time. And there's some really interesting things to reflect on there of how we both let users know about the limitations and manage expectations, but also show that governments are working towards improving data.
Yes, it's Marcela here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see Nancy's reflection, because I mean I was at the very early stages when the terms of reference were defined for the Zambia OCDS piece, and the intention at that point was to actually do the development of the procurement system and the open contracting, the OCDS sort of functionalities at the same time. But afterwards, in the implementation of the process, I feel that there was, and they can correct me if this is not right, there was like a lot of how you call that, a lot of pressure and anxiety to advance in the procurement piece. It might also have been that the vendor was much more comfortable with the procurement piece than the OCDS, thing that there was something new. And then my feeling is that the OCDS part was like put like for a second stage, and that might have been an issue. So what I mean to say with this is that there is also an issue of communication there and understanding of what is the importance of making this process as simultaneous when you're putting in place one, like a new e-procurement system, and the learnings that you're describing from that time, lack of time alignment and the consequences that brings is really useful to help others that are considering how to get into this and understand the value of really doing it as an integral part of the design of the functionalities of the new procurement system.
Thanks, Marcela. Yeah, that's a great point, and certainly something we can kind of reflect on in terms of that additional guidance on the process of implementing OCDS, that we document and share some of these kind of lessons learned from existing publications would be really good to capture in there.
Yeah, sounds really good, Tim, and I think Marcela really put the nail on the heart. So in terms of implementation schedules, because to be honest, we still have a lot of work in terms of maybe sensitization, in terms of getting the e-procurement system fully utilized comfortably, by the end users. So definitely a valid point. And perhaps just move on a little bit. So in terms of the policy we currently have on the website, the first presentation was very insightful. So perhaps we could learn a lot from that. I think we could do better in terms of maybe the inclusion of the scope, maybe somewhere towards the introduction, publication plan, definitely interesting. And also the idea of including a data dictionary, I think would be quite interesting. So maybe those are some of the areas we might work towards to improve the current policy. Otherwise, it's been a huge learning curve for us all. So we hope to continue collaborations, and we will definitely reach out in terms of any help, any guidance as we move along.
Fantastic, yeah, and we're really keen on the help desk as ACP to kind of learn with you in these areas to what's important and what's kind of pragmatic and feasible as well for publishers. So yeah, please do get in touch as you look to kind of make changes or improvements there.
To just share some other things that have come up in the chat, and Savage, if you want to speak to this, I don't know if we've got time, but let me know. But Savage has just shared some links to some of the publication plans from the e-government procurement system in Nepal, which do have some of that detailed field level mapping Duncan talked about in the introduction, as well as a feature I think we've seen in Paraguay as well of some good diagrams showing the structure of data systems, which is certainly really useful for developers and technologists to understand where data's come from, what process it's gone through. So there's some useful links there.
So I think we are just slightly overrunning the time we had scheduled for the call, but I'm keen that if there's questions or things that people would like to share, we could continue for a couple of minutes. So is there anybody else who's got reflections or lessons learned to share with the group?
I've just got a little one. I think use of the data is actually the important part of improving things. Actually getting feedback. The internal use by our commercial function has really put a focus back on us on data quality. So it's the things like understanding how the sort of feedback loops work is going to be increasingly important once you get past the first implementation.
Yeah, and that's a great point that, obviously engagement with external users of the data is really important to the goals of many open contracting initiatives. But very often the first user of the data is government and the publisher itself. So whatever you can learn from promoting the use of the data kind of internally with your organizations can be really valuable to making it as useful for as wide a range of users as possible. I'm just going to put on screen the really good diagrams in the document that Saro shared. If my screen will behave, there we go. So these are the diagrams which, as I understand it, kind of explain how data comes from the existing e-government procurement systems in Nepal, how it's processed through the APIs that Young Innovations have been working on.
And I think Saroj might be able to speak. I don't know if your mic's working.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sure. Along with this publication plan that we did in past, and it is more or less reflected in the public procurement portal that I also shared the link about. The question that I would like to raise here and would very much like to receive your suggestion, maybe in the days to come, is our latest initiative to work with some local governments of Nepal. So our public procurement law allows some projects go up to $100,000 to be carried out by user committee. Okay, am I clear?
Yeah.
Okay, there are some. There's a provision in the law where this user committee do not have to enter the competitive process, but yet can secure $100,000. But we are supposed to be developing some kind of policy documents for those local governments to be able to have their user committee data into OCDS. So we did a preliminary mapping that you can see in the spreadsheet that I just shared. It has the metadata in the second sheet. So I just wanted to raise an issue in here. Is like this is I don't think if it is a new thing coming from Nepal, or is it existent in all the countries like Zambia or some other parts of the world. So since it consumes a lot of money, lot of budget, so we should all I think we should also take into consideration those projects that go through user committees. That's the side I had to put.
That's fantastic, and definitely something we can pick up.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a couple of minutes for a couple of questions I had for Agnes.
Yep, I think we may make them the final ones, but please go for it, Marcella.
Okay, so Agnes, thanks for sharing that. That was really interesting. I had a couple of questions for you because I think you made a very important point in you're making all this effort in trying to connect these databases and using these two sources of information because what the OCDS has included is not enough or doesn't cover all the points that you wanted to see. So two things on that, and I'm basically talking from the experience in Mexico, which is the one I was a part of. Clearly, what is currently covered in the OCDS is the set of information or data that at that point we managed to agree with the government institutions that they were going to publish. But as you were saying, there might be additional data, or there is additional data that is not being covered, either through extensions or through other mechanisms. And the process that you're going through, I think, is really useful also as an advocacy mechanism to show the value to the government of how additional data can allow different types of analysis that the users are not having the opportunity to do now with the OCDS data that they are already publishing. So the question was how much of this exercise we are doing together with the government and in coordination with them so that in the process they can become more aware of that. And the other question I had also was, you're doing this work on the indicators. I saw first initial discussion that OCP had with the Mexican government some time ago about these indicators. Are you, how are you collecting the demand for those indicators or the design of those indicators? Are you doing it together with the stakeholders in the countries, or is that something that you have been working more from the technical side yourself?
Agnes, I think you're muted at the moment.
Actually, I'm here, so but there was some noise here, and I wasn't sure that the question is for me. But then I guess yes. So actually, in this project, we are providing consultancy to OCP, but I know that it's a very important goal of their project to also articulate recommendations for governments. So not just creating these indicators and publish them, but it's really a learning process, and recommendations are formulated based on these results. And yes, developing the indicators, it's not our sole responsibility, but we are working together with OCP. We will receive feedback from other groups, and I think government as well. I hope I answered your questions more or less.
Yes, thank you, Agnes.
Great, thanks both. So we're a little bit over time now, but that was some really insightful discussion, and I think hopefully, you know, underlines how important it is to provide that extra context to the data that's published. And I think that the points from Agnes and some of the points from Muno as well show how that lack of context can provide a real challenge to use of the data. So there's some good food for thought, kind of beyond what's in our immediate guidance on what might be important to provide. So Tim's reflections on Zambia's issues there, and whether a kind of status page could be useful, were interesting things for us to take away and think about. And I think we've seen as well that there is really good practice in the community and in the field, from what we saw in Zambia and Andrew's presentation of the UK's work as well. So we'd really encourage anyone on the call who's publishing OCDS data that doesn't have a publication policy to take a look at the materials that we'll share afterwards and think about what would be important to provide for their users. And also, please do ask the help desk for support in reviewing any draft publication policies or contextual information that you're going to provide. And also consider, if you do publish a new publication policy, perhaps consider sharing that on our mailing list so that other publishers and other people in the community are aware of that too. So just a couple of quick asks at the end. We will run another community call in the coming weeks and months, and we don't yet have a topic selected for it. So I'd really like to invite everybody to contribute anything that they'd like to kind of have one of these discussions focus on. Please put it in the text chat, or feel free to send us a message on the help desk. We're really interested in being driven by the demand in the topics we cover on these. So please, just before you log off, if you've got any ideas, pop a message in text chat. And my other ask of everybody is please do complete our post-call survey. So no need to take down the link right now, but we'll send that round just after the call, along with the slides and the other materials that were shared. So your feedback there is just really important to make sure that these calls are as useful as possible. So on that note, I'll say thank you once again to everybody that joined, and we'll wrap it up here.
Thanks a lot.